Hello everyone, my name is Swasti and I work at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses in New Delhi, where I focus on the different vectors of politics, security and defence of the European countries with regard to larger geopolitics and pressing international issues. What comes to your mind when I mention countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc.? They are one of the most developed countries with the highest human development indices in the world. They're often called the happiest countries in the world. So, this group of 5 countries in Northern Europe, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, they are often referred to as the Nordic countries or Nordic 5. And these have lately been in news for 2 reasons. First, when our Prime Minister Modi, during his 3-day visit to Europe a few months ago in May, held bilateral engagements with the Nordic 5 and also participated in the second India-Nordic summit. And secondly, 2 of its members, Sweden and Finland, have, in the shadow of a looming Russian threat, begun the process of joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the NATO, thereby fundamentally altering the security architecture of that region. So far, only Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia are left to ratify their accession into NATO. But then there is a third and often less explored factor of how geopolitics and geoeconomics have been intersecting in the Nordics. And this refers to their relations with Xi Jinping's China. When China was a country that preferred to be loved with respect to its soft power, perhaps its most sustainable outreach in Europe was to the Nordics. Ever since China started preferring to be feared instead, its snug relations with the Nordics started undergoing a transformation. Now, this transformation, how did it come about? Exacerbated by Beijing's poor human rights record, crackdown on Hong Kong protests, the global wolf warriorism that China is famous for, and its conspicuous engagement of, developing dual-use technology in the Arctic, and finally the COVID-19 pandemic. The China-Nordic bonhomie has turned sour. Now, the region collectively lists China as a systemic rival, second only to Russia. As a result, the Nordic countries are re-strengthening their ties to the Western bloc. It is also in this context that India's outreach to the Nordics, although a tad late, I would say, is more well-timed and well-oiled than ever before. Now, while I'm grouping the Nordics together, can I say that there is a common Nordic dimension towards China? So, although grouped together culturally and geographically, it would be rather fallacious to assume that the 5 countries have identical foreign policy goals, or common national interest pathways, or until recently, even identical international affiliations. And the most famous one is to do with NATO. 3 Nordic countries were a part of NATO while 2 weren't. And now with Sweden and Finland joining, all 5 are becoming a part of NATO. So going further, despite similarities, China's relationship with the 5 Nordic nations has followed markedly different trajectories. Obviously, economic dimension has been the main driver of Nordic-China cooperation. These high-income Nordic economies with the considerable resources in technology, because all of them are technologically very advanced, and human capital have benefited from importing consumer goods produced in China. Until a few years ago, the Nordic countries seemed to be eagerly pushing for closer ties with China. The engagements focused on expanding bilateral relations that ranged from a whole host of factors, like from frequently held high-level meetings to signing of MOUs, the memorandums of understandings. And the countries even outmaneuvered each other to attract more Chinese investments. This is just until a few years ago. China-led initiatives, like, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, all such initiatives were received very positively. In 2013, when Russia brought China with its deep pockets as an observer in the Arctic Council, it was welcomed by all the Nordic states. But the favorable perceptions and the favorable expectations didn't last long, and disenchantment soon came. So, like I said, that these favorable perceptions could not stand the test of time. And disenchantment with China became pronounced since 2019, owing to factors like the Huawei controversy, the Hong Kong protest I just mentioned, and China's infamous treatment of its Uyghur minority. These developments forced the Nordic countries to revisit their China policy. As early as 2019, early that year, the EU Commission, in its China strategy paper, called it a systemic rival, and a stand that was soon adopted by both Finland and Denmark. Then, early next year, which is January 2020, much to China's dismay, a pillar of shame sculpture was erected right in front of the Danish parliament in solidarity with Hong Kong. And obviously, this didn't go down well with China. In 2021, the relationship between Denmark and China soured further as China imposed sanctions against the Copenhagen-based NGO, and it's a famous one, the Alliance of Democracies. Now, coming to Sweden, the deteriorating ties could be traced to the case of a person called Gui Minhai and the Huawei ban, more famously, which has been met by Beijing's diffident shotgun diplomacy, in turn taking a heavy toll on bilateral relations. Similarly, Finland has been actively criticizing China's dubious intelligence activities. Last year, for example, in a critical report by the Finnish State Security Service, China was, in very clear terms, unambiguously called out as a potential threat to Finland's critical infrastructure. Wary of the Asian powers' influence operations, the Nordic region has almost completely rejected China's Confucius Institutes over suspicions regarding Beijing's propaganda machinery. This year, a few months ago, I think in June 2022, the University of Helsinki in Finland joined the universities in Sweden and Denmark that had chosen to close their Confucius Institutes. Now, let us look at the case of Norway, which has been a little different from the rest of the Nordic countries. So, unlike other Nordic countries where relations remained relatively steady until 2018, Norway saw its hitherto warm relations with Beijing plummet to sub-zero temperatures when the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize was given to imprisoned Hong Kong human rights activist Liu Xiaobo. Although ties were restored between Norway and China in 2016 and economic investments from China followed as well, the Norwegian government's reports in successive years have become more and more tougher on China. So there's a reason why I say that the China-Nordic split is likely to deepen. See, the Nordic political worldview upholds a rules-based world order that can safeguard its interests through open institutions, ideally underpinned by liberal norms. Now, obviously, it is a mutually exclusive position with respect to the global ambitions of China, and it's pretty self-explanatory. But apart from this rather fundamental divide, there are three underlying factors that show that geoeconomics alone will not suffice sustaining the China-Nordic equation. What are these three drivers? The first driver is the confrontational China policy adopted by the United States in 2018, the Trump era, which has kind of re-established US's position as the key security provider and partner of Nordic countries. Following the US's securitization campaign against Huawei, which kind of exerted mounting pressure on European allies and partners to stop using Huawei's equipment, Nordic countries have also been squeezing the Chinese tech giant out of their digital infrastructures. So Denmark was the first Nordic country to openly criticize Huawei as a potential security threat in late 2018 and early 2019 on 5G and took measures that effectively barred Huawei from their digital infrastructure, without imposing an outright ban. Sweden went a step ahead. Sweden was more vocal in opposing the company and went for an outright ban. What is the second driver? The second driver is the hardening and assertive, Chinese regime under President Xi Jinping, notably in terms of its handling of, human rights issues and crackdown on dissent, which is at loggerheads with the liberal democratic values espoused by the Nordics. Now let's see what is the third driver. The third driver is China's support of Russia in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which has resulted in a massive backlash against Beijing. Barring a few exceptions, such as Hungary, whose leader Viktor Orban is clearly very close to Putin and to China. So barring those exceptions, China is seen as a disruptive factor, a systemic rival who cannot be trusted, much like its all-weather ally Russia. This sentiment has echoed in the decision of 7 of the Arctic Council members to suspend cooperation with Russia. Now, when taken together, one can see how these 3 drivers have created a widening structural divide between China and the Nordic countries, highlighting fundamentally different political systems and an eroding political trust that might pave way for a broader decoupling agenda. But the question is decoupling possible? Is decoupling from China possible? Between 2018 and 2021, while China's share of total trade increased for all 5 Nordic countries, it also resulted in higher trade deficits with China for each of those. Secondly, China's share of trade with the Nordic countries remains between 5 to 9%, which indicates that the general economic exposure to China continues to be rather limited. There's one exception, however, which is Norway, where China, with its almost 13% share, was the main source of Norwegian imports until last year. So despite political differences, Norway and China are close to signing an FTA, the Free Trade Agreement, and very recently they have successfully negotiated a new version of the Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement. China is also a major source of foreign direct investment, or FDI, especially in Finland, where Chinese investment has reached 5.7% of GDP in 2020 and is now the 3rd largest source of FDI. Let's look at it a little further. Now, despite these positive economic indicators that I just told you about, China has used punitive economic methods against some Nordic governments and other actors to attain its political goals. Subsequently, the Nordic governments have also become wary of Chinese investments, thereby introducing new investment screening mechanisms. For example, Denmark did it in 2021. Sweden has already done it and it will take effect from 2023. Or other countries like Finland and Norway have amended existing laws to allow local authorities to filter foreign investments through a national security lens, and also bringing national laws in line with the new EU regulations. And remember that these new EU regulations are far more tight on fighting economic coercion, and they have listed China very, very clearly in all their documents. So obviously, what does it tell us? If you put everything together, you kind of realize that China's Nordic dream is not without its technical glitches. Now let us look at what is India's Nordic outreach all about. India's Nordic outreach has developed almost simultaneously with its deepening Arctic engagement. All Nordic 5 countries are members of the Arctic Council. The Nordic region looks upon India as a balancer to China's presence, and all Nordic 5, they back India's bid for a permanent Security Council seat at the United Nations as well. And looking at India, India enjoys positive relations with the Western bloc as well as with Russia. However, Russia's weakening legitimacy and stature in the region is likely to lead India to recalibrate its bilateral and multilateral engagement strategies with the region and perhaps venture into more innovative cooperation on blue economies, ocean governance, and green technologies. India's current status as the world's fifth largest economy is not really commensurate with its current bilateral trade with the Nordic countries, which stands at merely $13 billion. Now, this also seems insignificant compared to China-Nordic bilateral trade at $70 billion, for example. However, like I mentioned earlier, the systemic factors limiting China-Nordic ties present an opportunity for India and the Nordic Five to expand mutual cooperation that can be based on sustainable trade practices and trusted connections. The question, however, is to see whether we are able to harness this potential efficiently enough. I will be back soon again to unravel and analyze yet another interesting geopolitical issue with global ramifications. Stay tuned.